everyone, I'm Briana Becerra. This is my presentation, Queerness in Chinese Peking Opera. I will apologize, this is probably going to be a little long since there's a lot of stuff that I wrote. There was a lot for me I wanted to discuss. I also apologize for the butchering of names and words in Chinese, so I also apologize for that as well. But I will be analyzing my favorite film, Farewell My Concubine, and the film Madame Butterfly, all released in 1993. So both these films present similar narratives regarding sexuality, gender during a time when China was undergoing immense cultural change. Each film offers complex depictions of what it meant to be a Peking opera artist in the early to mid-20th century, while performing was becoming punishable by law. Coinciding with these social changes, we see the personal constraints our main protagonists endure in each film as the film explores themes of love, betrayal, and queerness. In this presentation, I'll break down the historical context of these films and examine the relationship between the main protagonist's sexuality and gender as opera singers. Additionally, I will compare these films and how they relate and how they differ within the given themes. So, a very, very quick historical rundown. A lot of political and social upheaval, chaos. We see the end of the Qing dynasty, the beginning of the Republic in 1912, the rise of warlordism, military conflict, internal issues, which things don't get any better when the 1937 Japanese invasion and the Second Sino-Japanese War, which then ends in 1945 with the end of World War II, but we do see the internal conflicts of the KMT and the CCP who are fighting for power. Eventually, the CCP does win in 1949, gaining power over the nation. So we see the rise of communism, okay? The CCP wins, and we see shifting powers of ideas and how the Chinese viewed themselves and their society as a whole. The Communist Party began rebuilding China, and doing so, they began to reshape it. As the companion to modern Chinese culture notes, in this wake of rise of communism, we see the radical attempts to rebuild the nation after the war, which soon evolved into efforts to scrub the nation of its past and rebuild it from scratch. There were heavy questions of distribution of power and wealth, but also cultural questions. Indeed, ever more radical calls for political change, and also that led to a lot of condemnations of traditional culture, such as Peking opera, which were criminalized as being representative of all culture and old society, as it was seen as like hoarding wealth and power and just other customs that the CCP was not liking. And that was only exacerbated with the Cultural Revolution 1966, and which was done to kind of strengthen the communist regime. And as the companion notes, the era was, built on fear. There was a lot of fear in which those seen as opponents by the CCP were targeted. Mass campaigns were also norm of life, and they were used to function, destroy many of traditional culture and other practices and other things that was seen as underground. And these campaigns not only entailed the destruction of the past, but the humiliation of those who represented it, and they were publicly shamed, imprisoned, and even killed. So, with the first film, Farewell My Concubine, directed by Chen Cage, showcases the tumultuous changes of China endured in the early 20th century. The film, we follow the decades-long story of Chen Jie and Duan Zhuolou, two famous Peking opera singers who grew up trained together. Things were great. They're become famous singers. That was later, turned upside down with the Japanese invasion, the rise of communism, and from there on out, their careers and personal relationship with one another would shift, and their lives would turn upside down. The film is riddled with complex themes of love, betrayal, fate, among these things we see, and we encounter an apparent queer narrative intertwined with a changing narrative or a changing environment on and off the stage. So a little quick rundown, a little analysis. The film centers around a traditional Peking opera song, Farewell My Concubine, a story about a powerful king who is ambushed and fated to die. The only person standing beside him is his loyal concubine who refuses to flee, instead performing for him one last time and killing herself after. Dee would be instructed to play this character, which she initially rejects, but then becomes kind of immersed in. And this immersion is fueled by the fact that Jia Lu plays the king, who he kind of grows to fall in love with. And this relationship kind of seeps into his offstage relationship with Jia Lu. But things do kind of shift and kind of get very messy as Jia Lu marries the prostitute Zhang Xian, who alters his relationship with his Die and kind of creates a very messy love triangle. Dia wishes to live out his life with Jalu, but that is kind of shattered with this rift in the relationship, and it's only exacerbated by the societal changes, the Japanese invasion, the civil conflicts, and the rise of communism. I did note that this dynamic, I believe, is not completely one sided, but just a representation of just Dia's loyalty as the concubine and unwillingness to leave him. But I do think Jalu does have this love for him as he is his lifelong partner and kind of fated to kind of stand by him no matter what, as like the song kind of entails. So the queer allegory of betrayal. So in the film, we see the rise of the CCP and decline of Peking opera being emblematic of the death of Dia's personal identity. Dia, along with other performers at the time, were publicly humiliated and forced to surrender themselves to the party and forget their past. The traumatic experience can be also seen as an allegory for being gay, as Dia is shamed for who he is and forced to lose that part of himself for the sake of general society. With this allegory in mind, the humiliation campaign in this film takes on an additional meaning, as Jalo betrayed him and separated himself from Dia and the art together. This act of betrayal can be seen as a way of Jalo denouncing Dia and his sexuality, and even the complicated relationship he had with him, as we can see in the images on the right of this before and after betrayal scenes. So as an analysis, the blurring of gender and sexuality. As noted, Dia had a complex relationship with the character he played, initially rejecting it, but then immersing himself. But initially, in this kind of world he created, he kept messing up his lines, refusing to refer to himself as a girl. He perceived himself as a boy. But with enough punishments, Dia finally complies, fusing himself with this role, physically and mentally, and also believing himself as the concubine, hoping this would get the love of his king, as this woman that he presented himself on and off stage. Eventually, with this introduction of Jung Shan and this series of societal changes, his loyalty definitely becomes to wane. But we still see his loyalty to his king, refusing to leave his side, even at times where they're not performing together, even speaking to each other. They always kind of bounce back to one another. And this loyalty kind of continues towards the end of the film, where they kind of perform for one last time. But in this performance, Dia kind of has this proclamation of self, kind of shedding that female identity and taking ownership of this role in himself. That was the battle throughout the film of this female male persona that he was really grappling with, and was I think why he was so mortified when Jalo kind of moved on. It's like, no, you're my king and I'm your concubine. And he kind of is loyal to the narrative and sticks by his king before taking his own life. Madame Butterfly, directed by David Cronenberg, follows a story of the French accountant Rene Gallimard, and with a complex relationship with the mysterious Madame Butterfly. Gallimard was stationed in China while working for the French embassy in the 1920s, and during a lot of international and domestic upheaval in the world and in China. The French account falls for the Peking opera singer Song Ling, curious about her Oriental nature and customs. Gallimard views Song and China altogether through a bigoted Oriental lens, believing the nation is subservient and docile, as a thought process that would mark the beginning of his demise. The film exposed themes of Orientalism, racism, gender, and sexuality. So, in the film, the bigoted Renee sees Asian women as very submissive, and I think with this way of thinking, he never questioned Song for her quote-unquote ancient ways of loving, all founded in themes of piety and modesty, respecting her traditions, and, this is why he never sees her fully nude. And there's plenty of their mysteries that Renee was unaware of. The fact that she was biologically a man and that she was a spy, because she was regaining the trust of the CCP because she was a Peking opera singer, and at the time that was highly punishable. And then once her identity is revealed in France, he is, mortified. And despite Song's initial intent being based on espionage, there is definitely this love that she has for him. However, he is unable to make peace with the fact that she is not the woman that he fell for. And in both ways, they have fallen for false versions of each other, leading to a very, tragic rejection towards the end of the film, where Song urges Renee that she's still the same person that he knew and dressing for him for the first time. only to be rejected. The woman that she created for him and in many ways immersed herself in was physically gone, but hoped that he could see past that. So there is definitely a sense of ambiguous themes of gender sexuality. Song had to play a woman on and off stage, and she really becomes immersed in this character. We see this when Commander Chin kind of confronts her. It's like, you don't have to be a woman all the time, but she really enjoys this female identity, and she's lounging on her bed reading fashion magazines, and she falls for Renee in this woman's disguise. And you're kind of left to question if, like, is Song a trans woman? Is she a gay man? Is she something that is a combination of those identities? She definitely falls into this gray area, and it's kind of is represented in the title where you have like the M, the standalone letter. Does that represent Madam? Does that represent Mister? You're kind of left to guess. And then we have this idea of gender sexuality combined with aspects of racism, Orientalism, and white saviorism, or this persona that Song created is founded on the white perception of the Asian identity, or the Asian female identity, which is believed to be docile and submissive. Renee believes Song is helpless, in many ways dumb, and he's emasculated and empowered knowing that he has the perceived upper hand. But in reality, he doesn't. And when it's revealed that she is a man, he's not only emasculated but also mortified by the fact that he may be perceived as gay. This is, keep in mind, this is the 1960s, so that's like, probably horrific and, very scrutinized at the time. This initial power that Renee thought he had falls apart and reveals his racist fantasies, unsuspecting Song had the upper hand all along. So what's similar between these films? Both these characters, Dia and Song, were immersed in this female character, both kind of forced upon them, they both had to play this female character on and off stage, leading for a lot of complex relationships with gender. Over time, they kind of melted in this female persona, and it kind of became a symbol for their desire to be loved by the men in their lives. Dia hoped morphing into the concubine role would give his fated king, a purpose to love him back, realizing this role, but you kind of realizing this role kind of took away his agency and ownership. This is why he kind of sheds this role towards the end. Similar, we see Song's narrative, also being forced into this female role for whatever purposes, for espionage. And she also kind of sheds that role as well in front of Renee. However, she kind of does it not as an ownership of, like, of her identity, but in hopes, Renee can still love her. But nonetheless, both had their narratives end as men. And no longer as that female presenting identity, and still longing for the men that they loved. And what's different between these films is that, in regards of how it represents, ideas of queerness, kind of lies in how Dia and Song were perceived by others and themselves. Dia, in many ways, despite, kind of seeping his female identity off stage, was very much still perceived as a man, which kind of leads to even more complex relationships with his gender of, am I Dia or am I the concubine? However, with Song, there is a sense of, like, fusion and grayness with her gender. She was perceived to be a woman by Renee and others. So there is kind of less of a little bit of separation over gender and sexuality. And I think that's why the rejection for Renee even hurt, because, like, there is that less separation between that. And that's what I at least perceived that was different. So the conclusion, both of these films kind of challenge her heteronormative binaries, exploring the concepts of gender, sexualities, in worlds, both in the East and West, that was not very, normal or seen as the norm. They're, both queer narratives, very explicit queer narratives, and we both see characters, being punished not only as performers, but as, queer individuals, and being as, like, kind of the seen as, like, how should I say it, like, outliers within hegemonic societies. Both of them kind of show the nuances of identity, battling the female personas they were given, and also grappling with the love they had for the men in their lives. In the end, they were both desired to, they still wanted to perform, they still wanted to be that person. However, they were kind of left kind of disappointed, and they were seen, and they kind of hoped they could be seen by the men that they loved for who they are. In some ways, they were to a certain extent, in certain ways they weren't. And both very tragic endings. And I feel like I only scratched the surface of how these films are representative of queer identity. I think, doesn't even take account of how Peking opera has always maintained to be a very heavily queer space. That's something I didn't really dabble into, but I would love to in the future. But yeah, thank you so much. This is going to be a little long. I apologize. Um, Amazing class. Thank you so much. Here are my sources, and once again, thank you.